Oh, hello. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so slightly different background to what you will have seen in my previous videos. So now I actually partially rent a studio space here in Manchester. So this is my lovely studio space. I'll give you a little bit of a tour. But today I'm going to be starting on my annual self-portrait. So I'm going to talk you through each step as I go along. And you can see here we've got a lovely brand new panel, which I'm going to start drawing upon. And yeah, I'm going to take you through the whole process from start to finish. So before I get started, this is the panel that I'm going to be working on. So what I've done is, well, it's a wooden panel, as you can see here. What I've done is I've put some masking tape around the edges. And that's so I can keep the wood nice on the edge. And then this was actually unprimed when I bought it. So what I've done is I've done several layers of acrylic gesso on this, just to basically seal the surface, and then between each layer it has then been sanded until it's super smooth. So this is the nice white sort of surface that I'm going to be starting. I think there's about 5 layers of gesso on here. The next stage is I'm going to start drawing it out. Once it's drawn, then I'm going to do a coat of clear oil primer, which will make sure it's completely sealed, it's non-absorbent, and so that nothing soaks through into the wood underneath, so we can keep it sort of like nice and it will keep going for a long time. So yeah, I'm going to make a start on the drawing right now, and you can follow along and we'll see how we get on.
Before I start a drawing, I normally like to create a grid on my surface. I normally go for something like 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters squares. This just helps me understand where everything needs to be, and also means I can check proportions as well, using some drawing tools. So this is what I'm doing right now. I'm going to speed up the video a little bit, but essentially I'm just creating a grid on the surface, and I'll replicate that grid on the actual photo source that I'm going to use. So before we start the drawing, I'm going to take you through some changes I'm going to make to the photo reference. So this is a photo of myself on a train to Berlin from my honeymoon. I've already made a few adjustments, but it's not quite exactly what I want. So I'm going to start by adjusting some of the colors and some of the lighting to get it a little bit closer to what I want. So I think I want to enhance the blue a little bit. Make this a little bit more cooler, as I think it's a little bit too warm. I'm also going to adjust some of the lighting a little bit in here as well, just to make the lighting a little bit more dynamic. So increase the highlights a little bit there. Let's see the exposure. Can I decrease the exposure a little bit? Can I increase the blacks? Maybe increase saturation a little bit. Essentially just will normally play with the image a little bit until I get it exactly how I want. Until I ended up with this, which is the lighting that I decided to go for. It's quite cool. The lighting's a little bit more enhanced so that the highlights and the shadows are a bit more prominent. But this is essentially what I'm going to be working with. One thing as well that is also really useful, particularly for the underpainting, is to work with a value version of this. So by that I mean just making it completely monochrome. And by doing this I can see where all the light areas are and where all the shadows are, and then I can make sure that my underpainting works correctly with that. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a version with a grid pattern on it. So this is these are essentially squares. You might see that they're not quite square up to this corner, but as long as they're square here. And these are going to translate to the 10 centimeter squares that I put on the surface. And so when I use a drawing tool to measure the size of the squares on the reference photo, I can compare them versus the square grid on the surface and ensure that everything is where it's supposed to be. So what I'll be doing is exporting this, and I'll transfer those to my iPad so I'm ready to start drawing.
One thing you might notice me doing is using this, which is like, I use it to just make sure that my proportions are correct. So because I've drawn a grid on here, I can match this to the grid on my iPad, and then I can make sure that anything that I do matches on the same in the same ratio, so that everything looks correct. Hi, right, so I think I'm pretty happy with the sketching stage now. It's not quite right in different places, but I think I'll be able to adjust that a little bit. So the next step really when I do these is I use these acrylic paint pens. So I'm probably going to use a black one, although I might use a different colour. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the outline on here with the pen, so that I've got a nice sort of the final lines of where everything is, and so everything's sort of set up ready for when I do the next bit. So if you want to watch, I'm going to outline the sketch now. Right, so I've now completed the outline. I chose a purple acrylic marker this time, and as you can see, as I bring you in, this is the drawing. I think it's mostly right. There's a few bits that maybe the proportions or the angles aren't quite right, but I can fix those afterwards. Apologise for the flaw. But now the main drawing is there, and I've also rubbed out a lot of the pencil lines. So the next part will be to cover this in a clear primer, so it's ready for an oil layer. So I'm going to start that now. So this is my shelf of primers. This is the one I'm going to use today. So this is a clear acrylic primer, and this is going to go onto the painting panel, ready for me to paint in oils. So I don't know if you can see, but this is the consistency of it. Kind of just looks a bit like glue, a bit like PVA. And then I've got a big brush, which is what I'm going to use to coat the panel. So let's just start right on here. I'm going to start with the face. And as you're going, if you can, try and maintain the same direction that you're brushing. Just makes things a bit nicer later on. You can be quite generous with this. And you may notice that some of the pencil lines start to streak a little bit, which obviously they would do with the oil as you're applying that. So by applying this as a layer beforehand, it means you're not mixing it into the oil paint, and it also means that your pencil lines don't get completely taken over or disappear as you apply the paint. It does mean we'll have to apply slightly thicker paint in certain areas where we don't want it to shine through, but generally
this should do the job at coating the panel and making sure it's ready as a surface. So now I've done all one direction, I'm going to go across in the opposite direction just to make sure everything is covered. And you might not be able to tell from there, but with a raking light going across, I can see the reflections of where this has been. So I can see that it's actually covered the entire panel. I'm just going to mop up any excess. Put that back. So if I bring you down a bit closer, you can now see where you can see all those layers of the primer covering the panel. So it's quite wet at the moment, so you need to leave this to dry, ideally for quite a few hours beforehand or overnight. You can also get a hairdryer on there just to speed up the drying a little bit, but it's still good to make sure it's fully dry before you start painting on it. Here we go. So this is the drawing finalised. Sorry, that is sideways, I realise. So I'll just rotate it around. There you go. You can see the drawing all ready to be painted on. As I mentioned before, you can use a hairdryer for this, just to dry it a little bit quicker. Doesn't take long, maybe just a few minutes, and then you can kind of get it touch dry, but you can see where the light is slowly becoming a bit more matte and less glossy on there, and that's how we know it's drying. I'm just going to speed this up a little bit. So after doing one coat, it did feel like it was a little bit rough in places and it might need a little bit more. So I've just been sanding down a few little areas, and I'm going to do one more coat of the clear primer just to make sure that the surface is nicely sealed and also still nice and flat. Although you do want some texture on the final version, so that we call that tooth, so that you'll actually get some grip with the paint. So now that I've sanded it down, I'm just going to do one more coat, just to make sure that's nice and smooth. And this is just going to be a nice thin layer, because we've already done a fairly thick layer with the first one. It's usually good to do at least a couple of layers of this just to make sure that it's nicely sealed. I am going to speed up this footage now. Doesn't take too long though, just to give it another coat, and we're almost done. So if you have a look at it now under the raking light, you'll see that it's actually quite matte. You can't really see the glossiness of the reflections. Now it is actually, it does feel fairly dry, but it's not quite dry yet, so you will need to leave it a little bit before you actually start painting on this surface, just because it is still a little bit tacky, you can feel, even though it's sort of dry on the surface, but you have got a fair amount of grip there, so it's not like super smooth. It kind of feels like a little bit like smooth stone, if that makes sense. So there is a little bit of resistance there, it's not fully smooth, and that should allow something for your paint to grip onto. And at this stage as well, you can just brush it and make sure that if there are any bits of dust or anything else that's gotten trapped in the layers already, you can just brush them away, so you've got a nice clean surface. So there we go, that's the painting surface now prepared, ready for oil paint. Okay, now that the primer layer is pretty dry, I'm going to start by doing a bit of a wash over this
with some oils. Now, one thing I like to do is when I've been using some oils, anything that I've got left over, I like to add to a little jar. So I don't know if you can see in there, it's a little bit gunky. But this is essentially just old paint that was not used, it was left on the palette. So because I don't want it to go to waste, I water it down with a little bit of, not water obviously, but I put a little bit of spirit in there, and then a little bit of linseed oil. You might notice as well, I'm wearing nitrile gloves. This just helps me keep my hands clean, so I can just take them off. I'm not getting oil on my hands, but also some of the pigments can be toxic, especially if you're using anything like cadmium or anything heavy with heavy metals. So it's just a nice little bit of protection, and also just make sure that you don't need to wash too hard afterwards. So I'm going to start by doing a layer on this now, using my gunky paint. Right, I'm going to grab the big brush. So one thing as well before I start, I will notice that this has gotten a little bit thick, so I'm just going to put a little touch of Artist Media in there. So the one I'm using is, you can use white spirits and things, it's often very smelly. The one I use is citrus based, so everything just ends up smelling like oranges, which is really nice. So I'm just going to mix this in, and this will make it nice and liquidy again. I don't know if you can see that, but it's just a nice sort of dark greyish colour. So the reason I'm going to do this is it basically adds a mid-level colour. So I don't want to paint on a white canvas. It makes it very difficult to see where the light tones and the dark tones are. But by adding a layer of something else on there, it means that you can work your shadows in, you can work your highlights in, and it just makes it a lot easier. So, right, let's start. Now, I also know this looks very dark, but don't worry, I am going to rub a lot of it off, so it won't look as dark as this once it's all done. Just mix in a little bit more spirit into there. Just thin that out a little bit more. Just a touch. Especially if you're using expensive pigments, this is a great way to make sure you're not letting any go to waste. And I know this is covering up some of the drawing now, but don't worry, I am going to rub it away with a rag. This doesn't have to be too careful, it's just to get a layer on there, so we've got something to work on. Just want a nice roof coat over everything. I don't know if you can see from the video, but you actually can still see the lines through this. It's not completely opaque. I think that's enough. So with that done, I keep some blue tissue in my studio. You can just use any sort of kitchen roll or anything like that, but now the idea is we basically just go and rub this off. Make sure it sort of works in. And we're not rubbing it off completely, but we're making it a nice, even layer. Of thin paints. And that's
This will also make the surface much easier to actually paint on, because you've already got a layer there to work with, so you can see quite a lot came off that. But it's paint that would have gone to waste anyway, so it's nice just to be able to reuse that a little bit just to tone the painting surface. I can just make sure that our brushes are nice and clean. Another quick tip, when your brushes are drying, don't leave them to dry like this or like that. You'll tend to ruin the ends. I tend to leave mine to dry on their side, and that keeps them from anything going into the ferrule bit, which is down here. So if you leave it drying upright, that'll all dry downwards, and then you'll find the base of the brush will stop being flexible as it dries. So if you dry it on its side, and make sure you I'm giving it a nice clean. I will use soap on these later, but for now, just a bit of artist spirit and stuff is fine, just to make sure that that's nice and clean. And now I can throw away my rags. Okay. Right, so you can probably see now that you can actually still see the drawing through here. So coming in a little bit closer, you can still see everything's kind of quite nice. And we've got that nice mid-tone grey across the whole surface. So this is a really nice surface to work on now. And you can kind of see as it sort of glistens, that's the thin coat of oil we've got on the surface. So the next thing I'm going to do is start the underpainting. So if I crack out my paints, and so for the underpainting, I'm going to use a mixture of some different paints. One thing that I really love actually is you'll find with oil paints that the different pigments that you use will dry at different rates. So especially titanium white can take a week or more to actually get sort of tacky dry. So if you are wanting to do an underpainting and be able to paint on it relatively soon without having to wait too long for that, you can actually get certain whites which are underpainting whites. I don't know if you can see that. This is an underpainting white. And this is fast drying, so all you need to do is you can mix it with your normal paints. It will dry really quick, and you can carry on with your painting. Another pigment that dries really quickly is a Prussian blue. Prussian blue dries very quickly. It dries within sort of a day to be tacky dry. So I'm going to use some Prussian blue, if I can find it in my pot. Here we go. This is some Prussian blue, which is nice and dark. And then I'm going to mix that as well with some nice... I'll go with the Van Dyke Brown. I do have a lot of colours from Michael Harding, but since those colours were actually a lot more expensive, I'm going to be using Winsor & Newton for the underpainting, just because it's just the underlayer. I'm just building up the different value range with this layer. So let's mix a little bit of that and we'll get started. One tip when you're painting is always have lots of shop towel or kitchen roll, whatever you want to use. It's really great. You're always needing to change the amount of paint on your brush. So having some of that available is it's really easy to just adjust constantly. Okay, so working on the underpainting, I've got my paints on the palette now. So you can see here, just a little bit of each. I've got these little pots as well, which I fill with medium. And then I'm going to start the underpainting with just a number 2 round brush. You'll notice from my reference picture as well, I've switched it to a monochrome version now because I want to get the light and the dark areas and just work out where everything is. So I'm going to get cracking on this, and we're going to speed up the shot so that you're in time-lapse mode now as I work. Right, so the underpainting is well underway. You can see here we're starting to get like quite a lot of detail, and we've got some nice value ranges in here as well. I've only really concentrated on my own figure at the moment, without much of the background, just so that we've got everything sort of in place. This is going to now dry. I'll probably come back to this in about a week, when this layer is fully dry, and I can carry on sort of building on the underpainting until it's just right. Because this is a multi-layered painting, you can do something like alla prima, where everything's wet on wet, so you're constantly working on the same painting. But in this case, I'm working on an underpainting in sort of monochrome, and then I'm going to layer on colours on top as glazes, so sort of transparent glazes on top. So this is going to be a little bit of a more long-winded or more traditional way of doing this sort of painting. So I'm going to leave it there for the day and then leave this to dry, and then I'm going to come back and do the next session.